Hi, everyone. Good afternoon. I am so excited to be here, and I appreciate everyone who is able to make it to this webinar, Healing the Hidden Wounds of Racial Trauma. My name is Malina Banavong Maladore. I'm a third-year clinical doctoral student at Antioch University, New England, and a first-year extern here at Wesleyan CAPS. I received my master's in clinical community psychology at the University of New Haven in 2019 with a focus on multiculturalism. So today's webinar topic is a topic that I feel is very significant and necessary to share about. And that topic is mental health effects of racism, also known as racial trauma, and how to cope and heal. So I was actually formally introduced to racial trauma a little more than a couple years ago by a presentation presented by one of the TAs in my doctoral program, Richleen Caesar, who has now since graduated. Her presentation of racial trauma was something that truly resonated with me. Aside from her own charismatic delivery of what it was like for her to be a Black woman in America, her presentation addressed, validated, and empowered my own experiences, reactions, encounters, and perspective of being a racial minority. When I was told I'll be doing a webinar workshop, I actually became really excited because I felt this was my opportunity to pass on the knowledge and tools. So here are the objectives for this webinar. So what is racial trauma? Why is it important? What is the impact of racial trauma? How does it affect people of color? How to heal from racial trauma? And what are the ways in coping with this? And of course, discussion and questions. So what is racial trauma? Why is this topic important and relevant now? One can think that everyone knows that racism and prejudice is bad. They can think that, oh, this is not the 1950s anymore, so why keep talking about it? So this was an anonymous email sent to several Black student organizations at UMass Amherst this year. It was during the first week of September, so not too long ago. I will not go too much into details about this incident, but I can say that it's filled with explicitly egregious, racist, and violent remarks targeted to Black students at UMass Amherst, using extreme anti-Black statements and stereotypes. It holds a message that Black students do not belong on campus and are not safe on campus. But this is not something new. This is something that has been going on for Black Americans and racial minorities for centuries and for generation after generation. A response made by the UMass Amherst Black Student Union wrote in the response, "We are angry, we are hurt, we are tired, and although we are disappointed, we are certainly not surprised." So racial trauma, also known as race-based stress, is real. Racial trauma is referred to as the cumulative traumatizing impact of racism on a racialized individual. Every day in the US and other areas of the world, adults, teenagers, children experience racism and witness lives devalued. Many people of color in the US every day are carrying unhealed racial trauma. While the symptoms of racial trauma are similar to post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD, we cannot label that both are the same, as it does differ from PTSD, as racial trauma is ongoing, it is pervasive, generationally transmitted, and affects both individuals and collective communities, while PTSD can be caused by a single event. There are many layers to racial trauma, where it results from an accumulation of historical, xenophobia, systemic, exposure, and media of racism and discrimination. As a Southeast Asian, Laotian American, cisgender woman, although I am a racial minority who have faced my own experiences of systemic and individualized racism and prejudice, I will acknowledge that my experience is my experience. I'm not here to speak about other people's experiences or to present myself as a spokesperson for all racial minorities in the US. Every person's racial trauma and experiences are unique. Intersectional identities contribute to this cumulative unique effects of racial trauma for each and every racial minority. It would be profoundly inappropriate to say that my own experience can be compared to a Latino cisgender man or a Black transgender woman. What I will emphasize and share is to acknowledge the historical and institutionalized systemic racism perpetuated against each racial minority, And how and what ways can a person of color heal from this trauma? As there is limited time, I will be sharing two racial groups examples who have and are deeply suffering from a US historical and institutionalized systemic racism. It is critical to acknowledge the extensive historical systemic racism rooted back from slavery to now mass incarceration, from Jim Crow laws to redlining. There's also the unjust police killings, the healthcare inequalities, education inequalities, and so much more. It is imperative to recognize that Black Americans are more exposed to racial discrimination than any other ethno-racial groups in the US. And this is individually, systemically, and historically, and currently face the most racially motivated hate crimes. For Indigenous and Native Americans, it is important to acknowledge the multi-generational historical trauma of ethnic cleansing, genocide, forced migration, and violent colonization, with dehumanized portrayals on the media as barbaric. It is important to acknowledge that they are one of the most economically exploited communities with the highest instability due to relocation by the US government, who have stolen their land. They reported that 62% of victims in these hate crimes were targeted because of their presenting race, ethnicity, and or ancestry. And that is a significant percentage of these crimes and murders that are racially motivated. The media and country are now, thanks to the recent racial movements, beginning to be aware of the tragedy and the horrifying experiences for people of color, particularly for Black Americans, and most recently, Asian Americans due to COVID, who may get attacked and are murdered just because of their race. So here are the new global statistics of hate crimes. For Black Americans, hate crimes in 2020 increased 40%. For Asian Americans, hate crimes increased to 70%. For Latinx and Americans, hate crimes increased 9% in 2020, with 517 reported. It's important to also note that hate crimes for Latinx Americans overall increased 77% since 2014. One of the most significant events that devastated the Latinx community was the El Paso Walmart shooting, carried out by a white supremacist terrorist in 2019 who targeted Hispanic Latino individuals. As for Native Indigenous Americans, while it does seem like there is a small number of reported hate crimes, these numbers are significantly and vastly underreported. And this, it's the same for all of these other reported statistics as well, as there's much likely higher crimes that does go unreported. It is also important to know that historically, the Native and Indigenous American communities, particularly Native American women, are one of the most vulnerable and underreported populations, as there is a high murder and sexual assault rate on reservations compared to other American women. Due to racism, we've lost so many Black Americans, Asian Americans, Latinx Americans, and Indigenous and Native American lives. So what is the impact of racial trauma? Well, racial trauma can be very impactful. It is pervasive and can permeate all domains of an individual's life. For someone to know that they will and have faced systemic individual discrimination, oppression, aggression, hate, dehumanization, and can be targeted and attacked and possibly killed at any time just because of their racial identity, because of their skin color, because of their facial features. Racial trauma is now recently declared as a public health emergency. In 2000, the US Surgeon General first stated that racial and ethnic health disparities can be contributed due to racism. And just to repeat again, this was only acknowledged by the US government in the year 2000. So this is only a little more than 20 years ago. Numerous studies and research have now linked racism with poor physical and mental health. The most significant research done is the Adverse Childhood Experiences, also known as the ACE study, which is a massive comprehensive study that assesses the effects of child abuse and related adverse childhood experiences, and with poor health outcomes. One of the related adverse experiences is racism. So what exact mental health impact does racial trauma have on an individual? Well, just like PTSD, the symptoms of racial trauma are pervasive, but also individualized. The trauma response is unique to every person of color, where it's influenced by person's particular physical, mental, emotional, social makeup, family history, and experiences themselves. For example, one Indigenous American may face anxiety from racial trauma and can be triggered when they are sitting in a classroom full of white students, while another Indigenous American may not experience anxiety, but rather exhibit avoidance and depressed behavior and isolate themselves from other students on campus. Racial trauma was found to affect three main domains on an individual's life, and that is psychological, biological, and social. Racial trauma psychological symptoms such as anxiety, depression, avoidance, hostility, flashbacks, nightmares, suspiciousness. These typically stem from like microaggressions, discrimination, violence, which were found and can lead to negative health outcomes, such as cardiovascular disease, increased risk of stroke, lower birth rates, high blood pressure, and even higher rates of asthma. In other words, racial minorities are more likely to experience a shorter life expectancy compared to white folks. The last dimension is the impact on one's social life, where the individual can develop ineffective coping skills and perception due to racial trauma. So the feelings of anxiety and depression and or avoidance can cause the person to exhibit isolating behaviors. For example, from the UMass Amherst racial email, Black students may be reluctant to attend classes and activities for the sake of their own safety. And that makes complete sense. For all they know, the person who wrote that horrific email could be a classmate sitting next to them at lecture. And of course, this affects their social experience and well-being. Another is the portrayal of East, Southeast, and South Asian men in the media, where they're portrayed as demeaning, unattractive, desexualized sort of roles that are detrimental to Asian American men's self-perception with this dehumanizing stereotype. They may hold less confidence and less positive body image because of the media. Or the portrayal of Latina women as exotic and hypersexualized sort of beings. A Latina woman may be anxious to date based on the media perception of being viewed as sexual objects rather than a human being. So again, racial trauma can affect an individual in various ways. So some psychoeducation on what trauma, such as racial trauma, does to the brain. When someone experiences a traumatic event, such as hearing a targeted explicit racial slur, it can cause the brain to enter a heightened state of awareness, activating our brain's limbic system. So this is the fight, flight, freeze response as a way to protect themselves in danger. Our body temporarily floods the brain with stress hormone cortisol, which overrides the rational brain. So in other words, in that state, the person is not using higher thinking or reasoning. The person is in survival mode and wants to protect themselves from the perceived danger. And typically, after the threat is gone, the person's able to recollect and recuperate themselves. Now, imagine having to experience these traumatic events as ongoing. Imagine not being able to recuperate, but being constantly surrounded with reminders and triggers of racism. These constant reminders, constant triggers can damage the brain's amygdala, hippocampus, and prefrontal cortex. Or in neuroscientific words, it creates challenges and deficits in the brain's ability to plan, problem solve, regulate emotions, make decisions, learning, and memory, really crucial areas of the brain. This makes it susceptible for the individual to develop a mental health disorder. And imagine being invalidated on this. Remember, mental and physical health consequences of racism was only formally addressed by US government in 2000, where we all know that racism happened, way before that year. And with that, there's still a lack of awareness of racial trauma in our society. Imagine being told of what you experienced and feeling was not real. Or my favorite, it's all in your head, it's all in your imagination. This creates a self-blame, an internalization, where the person may think, why am I so anxious? What's wrong with me? Why do I have so many problems? Is it just me? Even till today, there are unfortunately people who disregard racism and the impact of it, despite all of the evidence and research and just overall witnessing and observations. How can one heal from racial trauma? Are racial minorities doomed where there is no way to cope or heal ourselves? So fortunately, there are some ways to help manage and alleviate the symptoms of racial trauma. However, it is important to acknowledge that healing racial trauma is very challenging as racial wounds occur within a sociopolitical context and on a continuing basis. From current research and findings by psychologists and researchers of color, there are ways on how to cope healthily. So this is not about curing or fixing racial trauma, which is unfortunately not feasible. Hence the reason why we use the words healing and coping. This is about managing symptoms of racial trauma and how a person of color can try to ease and alleviate these sort of symptoms. One of the most important qualities in coping with racial trauma is resilience and building resilience. Here is a quote by a brilliant Black American therapist and author, Resmaa Menakem, who wrote the Healing from Racial Trauma book, My Grandmother's Hands. She quoted, "Something happened to us, something we can heal from. We survived because of our resilience, which was also passed down from generation to the next." So this is the road to resilience. I will delineate each component of this roadmap in later slides. So resilience is typically viewed as the ability to bounce back from adversity, which is true, but resilience is actually much broader. It is intrinsic and learned. So it is something that someone is born with, as well as the circumstances that they encounter. Resilience can also manifest individually and collectively, where resilience can be expressed communally by a group, organization, or a culture, and can be built and strengthened both individually and collectively. So like trauma, resilience can be passed down from generation to generation. And as Resmaa quoted, resilience is not a thing or an attribute, but a flow. It moves through the body. It is neither built nor developed. It is taken in and expressed as a larger relationship with a family, a group, a community, or a world at large. So resilience is seen as also building a supportive network. So good news about resilience, neuroscience reveals that the human brain always has the capacity to learn, change, and grow. So this is also called neuroplasticity, which is a very interesting concept. So the brain is designed to mend itself. And while trauma can inhibit this healing and growth, once trauma is recognized, addressed, and cared for, growth and positive change for the brain is possible. And of course, again, this is not easy, as it does take challenging work and time and community effort. So the first step in building resilience and coping with racial trauma is the person being recognized, the perspective, experiences, and history being seen and heard. This is the core of healing racial trauma, being able to connect with friends, family, organizations who are able to engage in racially conscious conversations and willing to help you process your thoughts and emotions is very important. It validates you, it validates your experience, and it makes you feel less alone, especially if connecting from those with similar racial identities. Engaging in activism is recommended by psychologists and researchers of color. Feeling empowered involves participating in action. So here is a quote by Rashida Tlaib. She quoted, "We are causing pain and generational trauma among our children by not truly addressing racism and hate in our country." And what she says is very profound. You know, to say racism is not real or to ignore racism, discrimination, that causes a lot of damage, a lot of internalization, a lot of self-blaming. So we need to be open about it, be very transparent, and hopefully to be able to share experiences of racism with other folks. So second is developing a positive and cultural identity, which improves someone's overall self-worth. Internalization of harmful stereotypes and negative ideas by the media, especially about the self, identity, and the racial group is one of the most damaging impacts of racism and oppression. This can be done by connecting with other folks from similar racial and cultural identities. So watching movies, documentaries, music from those who come from similar racial cultural backgrounds can be very helpful, as well as having these discussions about these stereotypes and negative perceptions. So again, this is easier said than done, but this is especially very important. In order to work on the resilience and racial trauma, it's important to have a positive racial and cultural identity, to not internalize what is fed to us by the media. So an example, I at least can say from my own experience, I grew up in a very predominantly white town, and it was very common for me and some of the other few Asian American students at high school to use terms such as whitewash or banana or Twinkie, or even the phrase like, oh, I'm not like other Asian people, I'm X, Y, and Z. And by saying these things, it's perpetuating self-hatred. It's perpetuating a very negative racial and cultural identity, especially as there's this internalization of the stereotype of an Asian American. There's also the shame of it as well, or being tokenized. So again, positive racial and cultural identity is and can be challenging, especially for folks who have not been able to work on those sort of developments, but it is very essential. So third is knowing your symptoms of racial trauma. So this include knowing like you feel anxious, depressed, difficulty sleeping, having this sort of fatigue. A suggestion is to make a list of situations, people, or places that trigger symptoms of racial trauma, and to make a similar list of ways to cope with each of these situations, peoples, or places. So everyone here will be given or will be sent a link on our website of a handout, which has like the racial toolboxes made by the Boston College multicultural psychologists with more detailed directions, as well as an outline. So all of that would be on your handout, everyone. So if you're not sure what symptoms you do experience, one way, which may be seen as very terrifying, but is recommended by the psychologists, is to role play with a trusted family member, friends, or community members, and to observe and take note what you're feeling emotionally, physically, and psychologically. Now, it is best to do this activity very carefully, and before you do this role play, is to ensure that you are in a good headspace, you're aware about some of your triggers, and to make sure to communicate this to the trusted individual and to let them know if you are feeling very overwhelmed. After recognizing the symptoms, write down ways to cope in the symptoms, such as grounding exercises or strategies as a way to sort of cope with it, and ways to respond to the negative racial encounters. So one way to cope with the symptoms is using this body grounding exercise. So this is again from Resma, the author of My Grandmother Hands, who have used this with many of her clients. So this is a body practice grounding technique. So for everyone who wants to participate in this, please follow along, and feel free to close your eyes if you like as well. So take a few deep breaths and let your body relax as much as it wants. Think of a person, an animal, or a place that makes you feel safe and secure. Now imagine that this person or animal is beside you right now, or that you're in that safe place. Breathing naturally, let yourself experience that safety and security for a minute. Feel it into your body. Where does it seem constricted, uncomfortable, or unwell in any way? Note each of these locations. Pick one of these locations and focus on it. For a few seconds, let yourself fully experience the constriction or discomfort. Then once again, visualize the person, animal, or place that helps you feel safe and secure. Imagine you're in that place or that person or animals beside you. Experience that safety and security. So if everyone can come back, so that was the body grounding exercise that I feel is very effective, very useful. So it sort of is a way for you to understand your body, when you're feeling anxious or not feeling anxious. It's overall just connecting, your mind and body together. So this next one, so this can be triggering. So for anyone who may feel comfortable, as this does involve recalling a microaggressive memories, feel free to mute until I move to the next slide. So for this one, and again, same exercise by Resma, is to think back to an incident in which you felt you were a target of microaggression. Now replay this incident in your head from beginning to end. When and how did that event run ugly, if it did? When and how did you recognize it as a microaggression? Now replay the event again. This time, focus on your body and its reactions. At what point does it tell you that something is wrong? How does it let you know this? When, where, and how does it experience pain or discomfort? Where, when, and how does it feel good? So try to use the earlier grounding body exercise as a way to calm the body down when doing this. So this exercise, again, was encouraged by Resma as well as other psychologists at the University of North Carolina, multicultural specialists in managing racial trauma. So I hope these were very effective coping strategies, which again will be on the handout. So moving forward, another way to cope with racial trauma is limiting social media and overall media. Now, this is not suggesting any avoidance or to avoid any ongoing racial events, attacks, or be ignorant of it, but to understand your own tolerance of watching videos or readings of members of the same racial ethnic group facing discrimination and racially motivated attacks. Because watching these racially motivated attacks can be really triggering and re-traumatizing. So listen to your body and recognize and honor what you're feeling when watching the videos. Do you find yourself having physical symptoms of anxiety? Do you find yourself having thoughts of hopelessness or helplessness? And when you do find yourself feeling overwhelmed, it is totally okay to turn it off, sit back, and relax. So lastly is self-care. And I'm very aware that most of us are likely aware of what self-care is, as it has been publicized on social media. However, I would like to clarify what self-care actually entails. I know for myself, and I've seen others post like memes and posts about self-care, and where it's like photos of them and others like drinking wine and bathtub with a sheet mask. And, while that can be considered as self-care, it's taking care of your physical body and relaxing, it is more than just one aspect. If drinking wine and taking a bath is like one of the best treatment for self-care, then that would be amazing. And me and other therapists will likely be out of a job. So physical self-care, as mentioned, is one of the most known self-care. So this includes taking care of your body, your physical health, eating healthy, drinking water, sleep, and exercise. It also includes incorporation of rest and relaxation, and just allowing yourself and your body to just be. Meditation, mindfulness are also essential in this physical self-care. So for everyone, pause and reflect for a little bit. What are you currently doing for your physical self-care? Are you drinking water? Are you sleeping? Are you drinking a lot of alcohol? Are you not drinking alcohol? Are you giving yourself breaks? What are you doing right now in terms of taking care of your physical self? So next is emotional self-care, which is the nurturing, the caring, and being in a healthy relationship with yourself as well as with others. So emotional self-care includes setting clear boundaries on your time and energy, and engaging emotional boundaries with supportive relationships and surrounding yourself with those who care and love you. So again, for everyone, pause and reflect for a little bit. What are you currently doing for your emotional self-care? Do you feel that your emotional needs are being met? Do you feel this receptiveness of others, appreciation, validation? So the next is the psychological self-care, which is basically the mind. It is the learning, the thinking, and growing, this sort of stimulation. So this is also where we typically come in, which we can say the same for emotional, where this can involve the, the, the use and guidance of a mental health professional. So psychological self-care activities, they might include professional and personal development. So this is more of giving space for yourself and taking time to reflect and notice your inner experiences, as well as your thoughts and feelings. So ask yourself, what sort of thoughts or thinking patterns are you noticing about yourself? Is it negative? Is it positive? Or is it just, something that's just neutral? What are you noticing in your relationship with others that you are not really too fond about? So with psychological self-care, it is more of cultivating the self-awareness through things. And this can be through journaling, getting feedback from others, meditation, and just giving yourself to just grow and reflect. So again, pause and reflect. What are you currently doing for your psychological self-care? So the last one is the spiritual self-care. And this may include prayer, and it also includes possibly joining a religious organization, but it does not necessarily mean anything where it has pertained to religion or anything like that. So for spiritual self-care, it is something that's much more broad. It is the self-care being aware of non-material and non-superficial aspects of your life. So this includes practicing gratitude, spending time in nature, meditating, identifying what's meaningful to you in your work and life that's not money or materialistically related. And again, this can also include practicing mindfulness and being present in the moment. So again, for everyone, pause and reflect. What are you currently doing for your spiritual self-care? Is there an appreciation that you share and cultivate in this world? So this is all that I have for this presentation. And I do appreciate everyone who was able to make this. And of course, there are many things that I was not able to touch upon or elaborate. So I do apologize if I do forget to include anything, especially for those who might have been looking forward to some topics, but please feel free to add some during our discussion. And again, just to elaborate, racial trauma is a very comprehensive and extensive topic. So as I mentioned throughout this presentation, I do have a resource sheet for those who are interested, the listed organizations and coping strategies, including the Racial Toolkit, which I believe will be posted on the CAPS website.